All right. I want to extend a warm welcome to everyone around the world in your respective continents and countries and time zones who are joining us today for this meeting on Healing a Wounded Society, where we are exploring the themes of reconciliation and hope in post-genocide Rwanda, 29 years after the terrible genocide there. I am Bill Barbieri at the McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Values at Catholic University in Washington, D.C. And as an organizer of this event, I'm joined by my colleague here, Hu Yeping, who runs the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy, and also our colleague, Father Marcel at Hekima University in Kenya, who was our very gracious moderator for the proceedings yesterday. And I want to give him a special thanks for organizing the participants for this event. This event is, among other things, sort of a book launch for a forthcoming volume published by Georgetown University Press on reinventing theology in post-genocide Rwanda. And we will at some point share more information about that book, but a number of the participants today and yesterday have contributed to that book, and it will appear shortly, and I certainly recommend it to all of you. I want to follow Father Marcel's example from yesterday and start us off with a moment of silence to commemorate the victims and the tragedy of the genocide in 1994. So please join me in the moment of silence. Thank you. We are joined today, some of the members of our audience are themselves survivors of those terrible days, and of course have a special experience to share with us and to contribute to our understanding of those events and the processes that have followed them. But at the same time, it's important, I think, to acknowledge as well that the genocide in Rwanda is a global event, and it's one that has affected all of us. It's a historical event for humanity as a whole, and certainly in this country, the U.S., we have occasion to think back. President Clinton, who was president at the time, has said that his greatest regret from his presidency was not having taken more vigorous action to try to stop the genocide. And the event itself, an event, in the words of the Nuremberg trials, that shocked the conscience of humanity, remains a challenge of reconciliation, first and foremost in Rwanda, but also in the neighboring countries and for the rest of the world that still continues to struggle with violence in its many forms. So our presentations today will plumb different dimensions of the question of reconciliation. I want to offer very quickly just a personal word of thanks to our many participants who are taking part in this meeting today in a language, English, which may not be their first language. And it's astounding, the array of languages that our participants command. But I'm always grateful for people who take that special gesture of reaching out to other people by communicating in a language that's not their first language. We will proceed today in two panels, a pair of presentations followed by discussion. We will start off with a presentation by Elisee Rutagambwa on the politics and ethics of apology. That will be paired with the presentation by Dawid Stelmach of Poland on reconciliation in Rwanda, tapping into his empirical study of the progress of reconciliation there. In our second session today, we will hear from Leocadie Lushombo on paths to healing, reconciliation, and sustainable peace in Rwanda, and also from Bill O'Neill on remembering genocide, the ethics of anamnestic solidarity. So I'll give a brief introduction for the members of the first panel. As you can see on your screen, we have both Q&A and chat functions. If you want to submit a question that's visible to the entire group, you can use the chat function. If you want to submit something to me as the moderator, you can use the Q&A function. That can be anonymous if you so wish, or I can mention you as well. And using both of those functions, we will facilitate a discussion after the first two presentations. Our first speaker for today is Father Elisee Rutagambwa from Hekima University College in Kenya, where he is, among the various hats he wears, a dean of the Institute of Peace Studies and International Relations. He works in a number of fields, including ecclesiology and church leadership, genocide studies, naturally, liberation theologies and political ethics, and post-colonial or decolonial theologies, and war, peace, and peace building. He was born and raised in Rwanda and lost around 40 relatives in the 1994 genocide himself. He was ordained in 1998 and studied, he's not alone among our participants, at Boston College here in the US, where he wrote a dissertation called Reclaiming the Actual Humanness of the Subject of Rights, Learned Lessons from Rwanda and Ethical Perspectives. Some of his more recent work includes a piece on the role of the theologian in genocide prevention, theology in post-genocide Rwanda. He is an editor of the forthcoming book on reinventing theology from Georgetown University Press. And his topic for today, as I mentioned, is the politics and ethics of apology in post-genocide Rwanda. So, Father Elisee, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Bill. I would like to start by thanking the McLean Center for this opportunity, and for you, Bill, and Hekima and Marcel, who took the initiative not only to give this taste of our book, but also to really help us, as you are aware, that the entire country, we are in this period of time where we are remembering our loved ones who perished during the genocide in 1994. So my heart and mind is with them and with all around the world who help us to remember our loved ones. And as we speak, I just lost a nephew who was heading back from a commemoration service. So they made an accident with a motorcycle, and it was, pain added to more pain. So I wanted to recognize and remember him as well. Now, as Bill mentioned, the topic I wanted to entertain you with is the politics and ethics of the apology in post-genocide Rwanda. Now, in response to the horrendous 20th century mass killings, very prominent leaders, both secular and religious, have come forth to express their apologies on behalf of their institutions or countries. Many others instead have persistently declined to apologize. They either deny the facts or blame the victims for their fate. Others again partially apologized or simply uttered excuses or confessional speeches without really taking full responsibility for their wrongdoing. So while political leaders who are reluctant to apologize mostly found their arguments in real politics, church leaders dismissed the initiative on theological ground. So the former suggests that apology corroborate a poor and weak leadership, which would compromise their status in the world and jeopardize their security and strategic interest. The latter, meaning the church leaders, they reject apology for fear that it might undermine the doctrinal sanctity of their religious beliefs or the credibility of their institutions. So taking on this debate in the context of post-genocide Rwanda, my paper scrutinizes the above apologetic discourses and got them in light of the normative conditions for a genuine apology available in the prevalent scholarly ethical literature. So after highlighting the shortcomings and of these apologies and discussing their justificatory arguments, the paper argues in favor of the ethics of apology and sees it as a sine qua non condition for a genuine church leadership so much needed in today's context, where the church is facing all kinds of scandals. Of course, this paper is part of the broader agenda, and it looks into rethinking genuine leadership through the prism of the ethics of apology, and it is a contribution to the upcoming volume just mentioned, Reinventing Theology in Post-Genocide Rwanda, that we co-edited with Father Michel and Father Marcel. Now, for the sake of this presentation, given the time constraints, I will only focus on the Catholic Church leadership apologetic discourse to assess its ethical genuineness, understand its justifications for the reluctance to convey genuine apology, as well as its underlying theological concerns, and then propose some responses that advocate for the relevance of the ethics of apology. And let me first begin by a brief reminder of the charges that was leveled against the church. Remember, in the aftermath of the genocide, the church leaders in general and the Catholic leaders in particular, they came under serious criticism for the failure to oppose genocide. Initially, they denied the wrongdoing, but factual evidence and eyewitnesses' testimonies proved the contrary. And so they had to face this reality. Now, let me remind some of the allegations that were against the church. There are allegations that pertain to individual church members, but there are also allegations that pertain to the church as an institution. Now, in terms of the individual members, they were alleged to have participated actively in the killings, or they were complicit with the killers. Also, the failure to abide to their religious teaching and duties. But most importantly, they were conducting the killings as if they were performing religious duties or drew their motivation from their religious beliefs. And here, for example, we have cases of perpetrators who are Christians who come after, their masses, wearing rosaries and Marian medallions, and who go to kill their church members. And so it's like the singing involved, the ritual, everything sounds like a church, a church activity. And so that is really was very characteristic of the genocide that was perpetrated in Rwanda. Now, as regards the allegation to the church as an institution, generally, it is the lack of moral leadership. Whether it was intended or not, at the time it was most needed. And so there were acts of commission as well as acts of omission. So in terms of acts of omission, there is, for example, the reluctance to recognize and condemn the genocide, and it is actual perpetrators. You could feel like they were alluding to issues of ethnicity, alluding to war or to mass killing, but without really specifying who is being targeted and who is the perpetrator. And so those acts of commission, including actual killings or complicity with the killers, ignoring the prior warnings of the genocide, lack of a strong and resolute condemnation of the atrocities when the genocide began, the failure to take the protests directly to the killers while gross human rights violations were committed against innocent victims, and the killings taking place in churches and in Catholic school buildings. There's the collusion with political leaders who were actually carrying on the genocide, the avoidance of the word genocide in church communications, the failure to publicly rebuke church leaders involved in the killings, rather than assisting them to escape the court of law. And here we have a particular case of a priest who was responsible for bringing in the bulldozer to clean up his church where about 5,000 people were killed, Father Seromba. He was helped to escape from Congo to Nairobi, then from Nairobi to Rome, and so forth. He ended up being denounced, of course, and was tried in Arusha. There was also the failure to publicly recognize the Christian righteous, the ones that my brother Michel talked about yesterday. So far, we have never really had a kind of public recognition within the church of these people who actually played the role model at the time it was most needed to show that even in the chaos of genocide, there were still Christians who were able to live up to their ideal of Christians. Now, there was also the failure to recognize the church memorial and the eagerness to resume the church activities in the churches that have served as slaughterhouses. And this was a long debate, and they ended up acknowledging some churches, but others, they have found some compromises. So in sum, what the church was mostly blamed for, it was not that it counts sinners among its ranks, but it is particularly that there were this unambiguous lack of apology, where it was clear that the church leadership failed morally. And this unconditional support of a criminal regime, which have been perpetrating discrimination and human rights violation, and the apparent reluctance to speak out when crimes negating the very reason of being of the church were perpetrated. And of course, after the genocide, the unrepentant attitude, as you will see, it took a long time for the church actually to acknowledge and let alone to apologize for the wrongdoing. Now, if I may, I want to look at specific apologies. There are many, but I picked only 3 of them. And I look at Pope John Paul II, now St. John Paul II, and I look at the Catholic churches, the Catholic bishops in Rwanda, and then look at Pope Francis. Now, when it comes to Pope John Paul II, at the time, he was really recognized as one of the vocal voices who condemned the atrocities and appealed for unity and reconciliation. And he was the first person actually to qualify the killings as genocide and call for humanitarian intervention. And this, later on after the genocide, he proclaimed the Jubilee 2000, in which he called the Universal Church to reckon with the sins of the past. So those were opportunities that really could have helped to really deal with these particular issues, which was the issue of the century. So more than any other pope before him, he has made several apologies. He apologized for the Holocaust, for slavery, for colonialism, you name it. And so it was expected that he would do the same when it came to the role of the church in Rwanda. However, in his apology, he only admitted the individual church members' responsibility, but he dismissed the role of the church as an institution. He said, I quote, With regard to the church, as I have already stressed, she cannot as such be held responsible for the faults of her members who acted against the law of the gospel. They will be called to account for their acts. All the members of the church who sinned during the genocide must have the courage to bear the consequences of the deeds, of their deeds, the deeds they committed against God and against their neighbor. So, as you can see, it is really not apology. There is no recognition that the church as an institution has some responsibility into what happened during this genocide. Now, there's also the Rwandan bishops, and the Rwandan bishops initially kept silent, and later when they were challenged to, to speak up, then they relayed the same official position of the church that was delivered by the Pope John Paul II. So their argument was that although the members of the church were involved in the killings, they were not mandated to do so by the church. Therefore, there was no need for the church to apologize. But as the Rwandan church was also both lay, lost lay people and clergy, the church took the portrait of the victim, and at some point also it alleged to be persecuted when the pressure amounted to account for the role of the leaders. Now, the only plausible initiative to apologize came at the end of the Jubilee year 2000, the year of mercy. And at this time, they took advantage of this propitious occasion that was offered to all Catholics to reconcile. So the bishop delivered their apology in a letter that was meant to be read in all parishes nationwide. So as the letter goes, he says, "We apologize for all the wrongs that the church has committed. We apologize on behalf of all Christians for all forms of wrongs we committed. We regret that the church members violated their oath of allegiance to God's commandments." Then they asked for forgiveness, saying, "Forgive us for the crime of hate in the country to the extent of also hating our colleagues because of their ethnicity. We did not show that we were one family, but instead killed each other." So as you can see, the phrasing is very general. It doesn't really target specific wrongs that the church would apologize for. Now, this led, of course, when this happened, people saw it as a good development, and actually even the government appreciated the move. But of course, they were not satisfied. And so the pressure continued until then the president of the Rwandan Conference of Bishops insisted that they recognize the responsibility of individual lay people and clergy, but none of them were commissioned by the church. He then concluded that the guilty had to face justice individually, but not the church as an institution, because the church was blameless. So this controversy went on, and of course, there was a meeting that was taking place, meeting of leadership, the entire leadership of Rwanda, including the different sectors of the society, in which this issue was raised. And then they recalled the fact that there have been apologies of the church in some other instances for some other crimes. Why not this one? And why there is this reluctance? And so after this, Pope Francis invited the president of Rwanda, and he made a specific apology in which he also implied the responsibility of the church as an institution. It is what he said. And actually, this is the communique that came out of the visit the president of Rwanda made to the Vatican. So the Pope implored anew God's forgiveness for the sins and the failures of the church and his members, among whom priests and religious men and women who succumbed to hatred and violence, betraying their own evangelical mission. In light of the recent Holy Year of Mercy and of the statement published by the Rwandan bishops at its conclusion, The Pope also expressed the desire that this humble recognition of the failings of that period, which unfortunately disfigured the face of the church, may contribute to a purification of memory and may promote, in hope and renewed trust, a future of peace, witnessing to the concrete possibility of living and working together once the dignity of the human person and the common good are put at the center. So, as you can see, at least there was this progression where we see that there is a recognition that also the church leadership or the church as an institution has some responsibility. Now, if we try to assess these apologies, there's certainly a good step in the positive way, but their consistency remained wanting. And I think there is room for improvement if we really want to bring about positive change and contribute to the effective and lasting reconciliation. And on this, I also subscribe to the fact that if you really like your institution, you do not want to cover up its wrongs, but you want to help out to correct those wrongs, because you are in a process where a church that is journeying towards perfection, towards holiness. And so we need to really address this because the stain they leave on the church is not a pride to anybody. So we need to address this. Now, here I would like to underscore their weaknesses and discuss some of the theological justifications or political and theological justifications or political justification in their underlying theological justification, and still indicate also ways in which this ethics of apology can be instrumental in reconciliation and also in promoting a genuine leadership for the church. Now, what are the weaknesses that we find in these apologies? First of all, the church leaders' apology took too long to materialize and let people suspicious of their intention. This has unnecessarily created a sense of mistrust that undermined the disposition of those who looked up to the church's moral leadership in times it was most needed, given the deep sorrow and the uncertainties they were facing. And here, for example, I could see there were a good number of survivors of the genocide who would no longer go to the church because the church represented the slaughterhouse for their family members. And they were looking for a word of appeasement, which they hardly had time to give. And of course, trying to be fair to the church as a whole, there were certainly some individuals who managed to make a difference. And there are not so many compared to the mass of those who got involved negatively, but there were always people who made a difference in this line. So instead of emerging from the realization of the church's own wrongdoing and the moral imperative to rectify the wrong done, the apologies were mostly made in response to external pressures. And I find that this is really a weakness to these apologies. Now, in terms of their ethical genuineness, here I try to use the sacramental model, which is a model which is in our tradition. And when I look at the political side, which is not the object of my presentation today, I look at various other models that help to evaluate the genuineness of the apologies. But here I would only just focus to this repentant sinner ethical model, which is the sacramental model. Now, so this is the model of the church, and it was expected that at least if you can fail elsewhere, we can at least honor our tradition by recourse to this model to apologize or to convey genuine apology. Now, according to this model, for an apology to be genuine, it has to fulfill the following important normative conditions. First and foremost, there has to be an examination of conscience, the recognition of the wrong done, true and honest remorse, detailed confession of sins, active repentance, seeking forgiveness, and reparation, and then achieving reconciliation. So looking at the different apologies, it is important first to appreciate that they represent a positive development in the church's attitudes. Because as years went along after the genocide, we saw a change within the church. So that was positive. Not only did it create a sense of relief and hope for the survivors, but they also reaffirmed many Christians who were disappointed and felt uneasiness about the contradiction within the church. How could they follow the church's teaching of pardon and reconciliation while the church herself was reluctant to admit her wrongdoing? So secondly, concerning the ethical validity of the apologies, although some of them met the normative condition of the repentant sinner ethical model, others either fulfilled them partially or failed to meet them altogether. For example, the conditions that were not met were the examination of conscience, the detailed confession of sins, true and honest remorse, and commitment to repentance. So as you see this phrasing where you make a statement, but there is no instance where you really go back in history and see what has been wrong with the church. So I must say that even when they conducted the synod, it did not really focus on this very issue of examination of conscience and get to see in detail and establish the responsibilities. Now, the failures to meet these conditions also affected the following condition, the condition of forgiveness and reconciliation, because these are the prerequisites for the previous one. So none of the apologies was preceded by any instances of serious examination of conscience to objectively guard the church's responsibilities. Had the church been seriously concerned about her role, she would have begun by questioning herself and openly reviewing her role from the colonial period up to the time of the genocide. This would have clarified the true responsibilities of the church, thus creating self-awareness of her wrongdoing and preventing her detractors from spreading rumors or false accusations. Now, it may be argued that the synod played a role in this sense, but the aim of the synod was different. And it took different speed and different shapes. There are some who actually looked at the genocide as one among other wrongs of the church. There are others who never really focused to it. And there are also some dioceses that did not start at the very time that they were supposed to start, and so they saw many dynamics. Now, the other thing was that instead of looking at this self-examination of the church leadership, the church appeared to be just the referees, the facilitators. It was not that instance of putting themselves into question and trying to see what needs to be done. Now, the third, regarding the confession of sins, both the Rwandan Bishop and Pope Francis refer to the sins only in general terms. There is no, like I mentioned, some of these allegations acknowledging, for example, we actually did not speak out, we did not do A, B, C, D. It is always in general. And none of them, they had detailed, they committed at different period of history. They still committed at different period of history, despite their causal relationship to the genocide. So there are some of the sins that were committed that actually led up to the genocide, like the discrimination that has gone on and on. So while the bishops mentioned some of the sins involved and blame them on all Rwandans indistinctively, Pope Francis only talks about the sins of the church and her members. It is as if all the Rwandans equally killed each other. Not only does this fail to account for the sin of genocide, it is distinctive character, but it remains vague about specific responsibilities that needed to be openly rebuked, given their gravity and their total denial of the reason for being of the Christian faith itself, as well as the values it stands for. Now, the church leaders may have been trying to be neutral and account for the pain of each Rwandan. But they minimize the nature and effects of the genocide and blur the responsibilities. And this is key when it comes to a genuine apology. You cannot just talk in general, because as much as each one in case is guilty, and sometimes you have also common guilt to share, but to be able to discriminate the responsibilities help also to account for the wrong that has been done. Now, finally, in terms of the redress and repair that prove the commitment to sincere repentance, nothing was really mentioned. Yet, it is crucial to sustain the hope raised by the apologies and assure the uprooting of evil once and for all. Of course, it is not too late to improve, since the process of apology is always dynamic, and as people's awareness of their wrongdoing matures and circumstances becoming favorable, there is still room to perfect the apologies. Now, to push the debate in that direction, I'm trying to look at what would have been the justification that hindered a more genuine apology and their underlying theological concerns. But before I get there, I want to mention the fact that the apologies were not easy. And probably when we look at this justification, we would understand why. Now, in terms of the justification, there are two types of justification. Some are the political motives, indigenous to the church in Rwanda, but others are doctrinal. So among the political motives, there's first and foremost the internal division within the church. And this was also observed among the bishops. And some were supporting the genocidaire or were relative to the genocidaire. Others were victims. And so it was very difficult for them to come together with a common voice to really make the apology in a genuine manner. So her collusion with discriminatory and criminal political regime. This was something that has gone on and on ever since colonial time up to the two regimes after independence. And also there are conservative clericalism. It was like a cleric is always a chief up there and is not to be challenged and so forth. And so that kind of mentality also played some role. There was also the clerical sense of monopoly of truth and reluctance to admit errors inherited in the part from the colonial era. Now, we have a number of false narratives about the identity of Rwandans and so forth, which was vehicled and which ended up being the token to divide the Rwandans. So none of these will be acknowledged, and we understand the difficulty. Now, there are also some doctrinal motives. One, some has to do with the ecclesiology, okay? And the first one has to do with the responsibility, okay, of the sins of the church's members. Does the church really bear the responsibility for her members, or should the members just endorse their own responsibility? Now, here I have some issues that I really feel concerned about. When you look at the significant number of Christians who got involved in the perpetration of the genocide, and you look at the model of perpetration, the ritual, as I mentioned, the symbolism, the use of church facilities, and yet you see the silence of the church leadership at the time. And of course, there were some excuses like fear, like helplessness, and so forth. But you feel it is somehow suspicious, and there is no way you can dismiss responsibility if, after 100 years of evangelization, so many Christians got involved in the killings. And up to now, there are some who don't even feel remorse. It was like they are executing a religious duty, as I said. Now, the church's silence seemed to indicate a tacit approval of their deeds. When whole Christian communities engage in mass murder in their very parishes, that's questioning their faith, and the church's very reason for being, there is certainly something wrong with the church that its leadership should be profoundly concerned about. For example, this question the teaching of the church prior to the genocide. Because if the church has taught these ethical values of justice, peace, unity, solidarity, and so forth, we wouldn't have so many people participating in this. And finally, there are also members of the hierarchy who were mandated to speak on behalf of the church and to make policies on behalf of the church. So when you say these people have no responsibility and they do not represent the church, it doesn't make sense. Because in the other instances, we see them speaking in the name of the church and the church take the credit. For example, there were instances where the church leadership would go to visit some religious who got involved in the perpetration of genocide and who had some responsibilities. And that was claimed as a good act, that the church is visiting the prisoners. But for example, we do not ask, why does not the church leadership visit the victims of genocide once they are targeted because they give testimony? And you could see that kind of double standard in the approach. Now, they are precisely the people, these are the people now that Pope Francis were actually talking about and asking forgiveness for them, because these are people who actually represent the church as an institution. Now, the other doctrine of dimension is how to reconcile the church sinfulness and her holiness. Now, how does recognizing the church's sinfulness remain consistent with our holiness? Do the sinful acts of some members of the hierarchy imply the church's loss of holiness? How then does the ethics of apology, rather than contradicting the church's holiness, reinforce and contribute to it? So this is another question I want to now here, and I want to remind that when the Pope, former Pope Pope John II, Dr.
Elisee, just with a view to our time, I'd request that you begin to wrap up.
I'm wrapping up with my last slide.
Very good.
Yeah. So I was saying that when Pope John Paul II proclaimed the Jubilee year of 2000, he commissioned a committee to look into, what is needed to be done. And so the issue was raised: how, if you get involved in all this, looking back into the church's sins, how does that not affect the doctrine of the church, the doctrine of holiness? And so, among other theologians, is Francis Salvan, who is an ecclesiologist, and he recourse to this concept of the church as a pilgrim people of God. And in this, he recognizes the fact that as a church, we are in constant need of repentance, constant need of renewal. And as he puts it, as a people, the church is a human institution, always in need of reform, always in need of purification. It is a people led by the human leaders who are fallible in every decision they make, except when they solemnly define the doctrine of faith and morals, etc., etc. But the point he wants to make here is to show that none of us, whether you are a church member or a church leadership, we are exempted from repentance. We need to keep converting. Now, so this does not contradict the holiness of the church, he says, because when we engage in this practice of conversion, we actually work out our sanctification. And so there is no contradiction. Now, Pope Francis also articulates this when he talks about the necessity of conversion. And he says, full-time Christians don't sit down to admire their faith in reflection of a mirror, nor talk about it over dinner, but they come out of themselves, embrace their cross with courage, and walk the streets to share with everybody the joy of the gospel. So, and Pope Francis goes even further when he talks about the church as the church of mercy, because here he brings in the whole concept of the needed leadership, a leadership that leads by example, a leadership that is not just remote from the people, but really partake into what is happening. And you remember, for example, when there was some allegations about one of the bishop in France, he said people should not be scandalized that even the bishop are sinners. We are all sinners. But what is most important is for sinners to be able to repent and to become a new creation. So on the other hand, as he repeatedly says, thereby indicating the type of leadership needed today in the church should not retreat inside the clericalism and doctrinal ivory tower. Instead, she should go to the furthest boundaries and outskirts of human existence to meet the poor, the marginalized, and the last. This is even more compelling for the church leadership, since as Christ's disciples, they are called to a generous, practical, and consistent solidarity, but also actively affirm the human dignity, pursue justice, and build a civilization that is effectively human. So as I come to the conclusion, considering the dear reality of the current leadership crisis and its consequent impasse in dealing with the ever-growing unaddressed humanization and persistent tension among people, it is imperative to reconsider more seriously the alternative that the ethics of apology has to offer as a constructive basis for thinking, authentic, and more effective leadership. Although such an initiative remains controversial and is fought by the very forces responsible for the existing deplorable situation, it is nonetheless crucial. Otherwise, we risk endlessly reproducing wasted lives and pretending to bring victims' cases to closure simply by silencing their voices. Recent developments worldwide awareness is a kairos that should not be wasted. The development and admission of crimes such as slavery and colonialism, a crime against humanity, provide ample evidence that the time is right for engaging a serious discussion on this matter. Indeed, it is not enough to pretend to solve the problem simply by symbolic gestures or measured rhetoric that avoid facing up the profound grievances. There is no better opportunity than now to take seriously the ethics of apology and make it the cornerstone of leadership. Thank you very much. Bill, you are muted.
Thank you very much, Father Elisee, for that very probing analysis of the ethics of apology. I look forward to returning to this in the Q&A period, but for now, without further ado, let me introduce our next speaker, Father Dawid Stelmach. He comes to us from the Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland, where he teaches theology and specializes in reconciliation in general, and also teaches on Christianity and its relation to pop culture. I've had the great pleasure of welcoming him to speak to my students about the relationship between the church and culture. For our purposes today, he's drawing on research for his habilitation, a study carried out in Rwanda of the record on reconciliation there. And I think part of his perspective here, as we'll hear, is also maybe shared in part by Poland's own efforts to reconcile itself to its history of communism. So speaking on reconciliation in Rwanda, a generation after the genocide, Father Dawid, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Bill. And I will share with my desktop. Is it easy to see right now?
Yep.
Do you see this? Okay. Okay. Yeah. As you mentioned, Bill, I really wish to speak today, especially about the reconciliation in Rwanda, and it will be the schedule of my presentation. The presentation, the topic of my survey and investigation in Rwanda in the last five years at least, and it will be concluded with some theological views. So how it happened that I was interested living in Poland in the country that has its own experience of complicated past, because I think it's widely known that we lived after the Second World War under the Soviet Union influence. Well, frankly, we've been possessed by this Soviet communist government, and most of so-called democratic countries or social democratic countries, we run our life without any liberty. So it was almost a miracle that we regained the independence. So after the finishing of the communism in Europe, in Mid-Eastern Europe, we found that some of the people of the church, some priests, bishops, and even lay people who were involved in the church, they've been also collaborating with the communist regime, and according to the percentage, it was something between 10 to 15% of the clergy. And as it was mentioned in the lecture before, yeah, there is always problem, yeah, with the responsibility of the principles of the church, how to find in this new situation and how to respond for the painful past. And my first attempt with my doctorate was on the goal of the proposal of reconciliation for those priests who collaborated with the communist regime, and it was maybe not stopped. I decided to do not continuing this because I discovered that the atmosphere is not very well for this in Polish church. Honestly, well, those 15 years ago, when I started to do something in this way, there was officially confirmed that there was 14 still living bishops who collaborated with the communist regime. Not known the right number of the priests, and altogether since the Second World War, it was about 30 bishops who collaborated with the regime. So there was no will to continue this investigation, but I was really interested in reconciliation in general, so I decided to do something similar. And meanwhile, I became the director of the Pontifical mission operations in my diocese, and I participated in one of the projects, humanitarian project in Rwanda, and I flew with the group of the students to Rwanda, and also I started preparations for the future survey. So next year, in 2018, I've made a pilot survey to collect them with the open questions, to collect the answers given by the Rwandans, to catch the point how Rwandans are describing some primary terms like reconciliation, like the peace, and etc. And after coming back with those survey, it was developed, and I started to prepare the final version of survey, and it was in the beginning of 2020, just like the coronavirus crisis. And I couldn't go to Rwanda to do by my own those surveys. So remotely, I created a special team with 3 leaders and 20 students who were prepared to collect the answers from a survey. And this final survey was sent 3 times to Rwanda, and it had to be completed and revisioned because there were some mistakes, and there were suggestions from Rwanda that the questions should be changed, and sometimes the place of one question should be placed in the different part of this survey. And for example, this survey had 4 pages, 19 questions. Sometimes there were complex questions, and it was prepared only with the closed questions without any open questions. To recalculate it in much more easier way. And I had a special team of 2 ladies who were involved in the preparing surveys and calculating the results of the survey. So they helped me with this finally. So finally, it was the 1,200 participants. And what was the goal of my survey? Because approximately 25 years ago is about the age of the one generation. So it is the very unique moment where in Rwanda are still living survivors of the genocide, and also there is another generation of people who were born after the genocide, and they know a lot about the genocide, but they know from the it's given them by the other people, and they have their own perspective, but also they are very critical. I believe that they are very critical in many cases about the genocide and how they look on the case of the genocide on their own. So that's why I wanted to catch this very unique moment where we have the change of the generations, and still we have survivors of the genocide. And now I will introduce and show some tables with results of my investigation. So this is the number of people who took part in this in the survey. And maybe one thing more about this, because when the COVID started in May 2020, so the entire Rwanda, like many countries, they were completely closed down, and it was impossible to fly to Rwanda and conduct the investigation on my own. So those 3 leaders, they involved those 20 students, and especially when the schools were closed, they came back to their homes. So they took the formularies of the survey, and they were visiting people, and they were speaking with them and collecting their answers. And then it was taken photographs, and they were sending via WhatsApp to me, and I was copying those pictures of the formulas of survey. So we see the biggest number of people who wanted to take part in this investigation was those who were born after the genocide, and the smallest number was those who survived the genocide. So it shows how complicated it is, that especially those who knows that there is a very gentle issue, the case of genocide, and also talking about this, and especially talking about the reconciliation. But there was a big number of young people who really wanted to understand it deeper, and they also wanted to share with their point of view on the reconciliation and also on the genocide. And also after the experiences of the Second World War in Europe, where there was thousands and millions of people who lost their faith in God, I asked about their attitude to the faith of God in God, and I was really surprised that how many people are still believing in God in Rwanda. So I must say that is, I think it's some kind of a new value that is given by Rwanda, because it shows that the faith in God helps people to pass it through the experience of the genocide, the results of the genocide, all of the traumas, and how they see their hope in faith in God. Completely different than in the Western world. like in Europe or in America, where sometimes the traumas are the cause to lose the faith to God. And how people see the meaning and understanding of reconciliation. And there were 4 answers prepared, and they were combined from the propositions of the many different answers, but requiring the size of this survey, we had to, in our team, to reduce them and to ask about the different point of views. So, as we see, people they were responding that what is for them the reconciliation, the people's joint attempts, the Christian process, striving for social peace, and help of state institutions to removing sources of conflict. And as we see, especially when we join those different scales of the answers, how people were supporting or not supporting, we see that almost all of them, they were equally supported. So I interpreted it as that they wanted to show that sometimes they see that all of those elements are important in the whole process of the reconciliation. And how important is reconciliation for the Rwandans, for Rwanda, but in their perspective? So they marked it's a very important. So we see that this issue is still living in Rwanda. And what is more important, reconciliation in my life, in social life, or both are equally important? And the vast majority marked, almost 80%, both are equally important. What is the state of the reconciliation? And it was one of the questions that was corrected in Rwanda. So because in the beginning, I asked about that we can speak about the complete reconciliation, or there is no reconciliation. And Rwandans, they asked for another one answer, that reconciliation is ongoing process. And it was really the real match, because we see this almost 70% who answered like that. And when I asked about the state of reconciliation, I also asked about the future reconciliation in Rwanda. And yeah, that complete reconciliation can be achieved, and 80% people believe that is possible. So especially when we consider this with the question about the current state of reconciliation, when the 70% answered, yeah, that is ongoing process. So it means that it is very realistic valuation. But also the question about the future, it shows that 83%, almost 84%, people are responding. We really believe that the full reconciliation is possible in Rwanda in future. Who helped the most? And there was the question, of course, it was a question about the process of reconciliation. And in this question, people could mark more than one answers, because sometimes they could experience help from a different institutions. So we see, of course, that's the first one who was also the responsible for the reconciliation, the whole process, is government. But also, what was very surprising for me, that very highly evaluated was the church. Also media, religious communities. Religious communities is about the questions like the orders, Palatines, Benedictines, Franciscans, etc. And also the help of the institution, the schools, and single men, and also the help of other international organizations. Who can help in the future? And quite similar answers. The biggest faith is put in government, then church, also media, and other communities, also school and the Christian centers. What are the conditions for achieving the full reconciliation in the future? And we see that the most pointed, more than 50%, was the telling the truth about the history. It shows how big is need of this in this issue. And on the second place, the respecting for the evangelical love of neighbor by all. And also we can see how it is diverse with them according to gender and place of the residence. And sometimes there is a 5 points of difference. And yeah, there is the biggest difference, I think. And also according to the place of the residence where people live, there is also difference in this answer. And what can impede the complete reconciliation in the future? And there are two almost equally chosen: difficulties of understanding Christian reconciliation and also lack of justice for all persecutors without exceptions. And my conclusions: that reconciliation in Rwanda is seen as a very important, both in personal and social life, and understanding of the reconciliation, as I mentioned before. All of those 4 proposals are equally important for those who responded in the survey. What else? The complete reconciliation is not happened. It's not happened, but there is a big faith and a big hope for the future that it will be possible to fulfill it in the future. And there is a process that is still ongoing, but there's a big chance to accomplish it in the future. In the past, the state and the church contributed the most, but also in the future, state and the church that are most helpful to proceed the reconciliation. The most important condition for reconciliation in the future is telling the truth about the history, and the greatest difficulties of the complexion of reconciliation is about the difficult understanding Christian reconciliation and bring the justice to all the perpetrators or torturers without exceptions. And there are general conclusions, and the final one is my theological view. And also my perspective is also given by the Polish experiences, because especially with them considering with the Rwandan context, I see how important is the example of the Rwandan reconciliation, because I see that this what happened in Rwanda, this horrific genocide after those 100 days when it was stopped, there was a big question: what's next? And the current state in this moment of the finishing the genocide, it was, we have no choice. We have to put the whole nation, all the tribes, all the clans in one. And if we don't do this, we have no chance to survive in the future. So they started to do something. And it was like a common working together to leaving the problems behind, but starting to do something together. And in my country, in Poland, there was a lot of discussions over the issue of the reconciliation, what we should do, how we should treat the priests who were collaborating with the communist regime, what we should do, what should be the restrictions for them, etc., etc. But there was a lot of discussion, but nothing was done. And especially when I consider this with Rwanda, I see that the reconciliation is more like action than discussions. And also, we are never enough ready to start reconciliation, but we should sketch some guidelines and start to do something. Because if we will be waiting, we won't start with this anywhere. What also shows the Rwandan example, the reconciliation is a long-term process. And we have to be prepared, because now after one generation, we see that it won't be finished so fast. So we have to be prepared that it can take a few generations even in the future, but it will be completed. So yeah, reconciliation is a long-term process. And what is also important, you cannot fully control it. You will be surprised in many moments. But if you are dedicated to do reconciliation, you will see the graceful fruits of this process. And what also is important, we have to work for reconciliation, but finally we will be given by the gift of the reconciliation. It's not produced of our hands, but is the sum of our work and also God's grace. And if we receive it, also it requires care, because it's not given for all the time, for whole life. Also, in the third point, I see the faith in God as a support, big support, and it's the big example of Rwanda for entire world today. Unlike in the Holocaust, where people were losing their faith because of the horrific actions, I see the Rwandan people who are gathering in different places where they can find some therapy when they are staying in the sanctuaries, because they see that they have to do something with their life. And sometimes they are asking as a faithful people, and sometimes they are asking as a non-believers. But it shows that they see the presence of God as an option that is helpful and can support their tries to achieve the final reconciliation. And is a really new quality that is Rwanda given to the entire world today. Faith in God is not a problem in the process of reconciliation. It's a big support. Also, in my investigations, I found that almost about, or even more, 250 people, clergy people, died during the reconciliation, and they also should be memorized in some way, because a lot of witnesses, they are dead, and is a big problem and big it's very hard work for today for the Rwandan church, but like with the Sister Felicite, it's possible. And I see that one of those people who are working to memorizing the Sister Felicite, I think, is the Jean Damour, who is now studying in the United States, and he's also involved in the process of memorizing the Sister Felicite. Also, I tried to find how big was the number of those who were collaborators during the genocide. And when I've been to Rwanda and I spoke with the local priests, they were claiming that it was no more than 5 people, 5 priests. In Polish literature, I found that there was no more than 21 clergy, including pastors. So even if we consider collaborators with the genocide and also those who died because of a genocide, we see that there's 10 to 1. But it's not official sources taken. But also, when we speak about the responsibility of the clergy of genocide in Rwanda, I must say that is also one of the public issues in Poland, because we had some Polish missionaries, Palatines, Marian fathers, who started work in 70s in Rwanda. Also, I think the most known, especially in Rwanda, Palatine priest, Father Henryk Hozer, who was also the apostolic delegate to Rwanda just after the genocide, some time of the pronuncio, something like that. He was nominated especially by the John Paul II. When he came back to Poland, because he was nominated by the Father Pope Benedict, the Bishop Ordinary of one of the Warsaw Bishopal Sees, he was very often accused by the public opinion that he was the one of the responsibility for the genocide in Rwanda. So I see that also in Poland sometimes this issue comes and there is a big need to show how complex was the role of the church in Rwanda, not also during the genocide, but also how complex it is about in case of the responsibility, but also how complex it is, the role of the church that is trying to help to improve the reconciliation, and how many things are done now in the church in Rwanda at this moment. And the last thing, because there was a question yesterday about the Christian context of the reconciliation. I see that is a broader case than just the religious or faith context, because everybody needs a reconciliation in the personal conflicts. And even in the mediation process, when people go to the trial, to the court, there is one of the theories that is telling about the mediation process that it always should be finished with the reconciliation, because the mediation is not designed just to share the assets and to keep the money, for example, 50-50, but it's just a matter of the material things. But also there is non-material aspects, which is sometimes more sorrowful and has a bigger potential to reunite people together. Because this is the matter of the reconciliation, to put this what was divided into one again, and it is a gift. So to regain the lost unity. Thank you very much. It's my...
Thank you very much, Father Dawid. I'm going to show my applause sign there. I am going to check back in with Father Elisee just to ask if you have any quick thoughts in response about this empirical study by Father Dawid.
I think it is very telling, and I am actually encouraged to see that, especially among the younger generations. So what I take from that is we have a younger population. Actually, the majority of the Rwandans now are less than 25 years old, which means we have the majority of Rwandans who have never had the gunshot, for the last 29 years. And that is already something very important because they are lived in the security, and the response in the country is positive. Whether you go to church, whether you go to the government institution or to social, to civil society. So the relevance and the importance of reconciliation, I think it is evident because this has been the focus ever since the genocide was perpetrated. After the genocide, every single effort was put into reconciliation and unity. And there was a removal of all kind of structures that used to divide people and so forth. Like in the past, if you were to go to school, you had to keep standing up because they asked the Tutsi to stand up and Hutus to stand up. So it was really too much pressure. So this generation don't have that. And another dimension is that now the focus is on development. So each one wants to make a living, each one to look forward to be someone, to be able to achieve something, and that really helps. Now, the fact that the church and the government appear to be the ones who have been more instrumental in promoting reconciliation is simply because they are the two basic institutions that deal with people on a regular basis and closely. But there is also something that probably might be unusual, especially for those who follow the media and so forth, because there is a tendency when it comes to Africa to see always the reality in a dichotomic way. So whenever you go somewhere and say you are Rwandese, people ask you, are you Hutu or Tutsi? That's what comes to mind in the first place. And this is part of the fake narrative that has been developed actually to divide the country. And in real life, people are mixed in families, at work, in their dwelling places, everywhere, which is far different from places where you have different groups living separate. Because the more you live together, you meet, you have opportunities for reconciliation. Whereas when you are separate, you cannot visit each other, you do not get to know each other, then it becomes almost impossible. So that is quite something understandable. And also, when people were trying to look back and see what really brought the division to the country and why this happened, for people who used to intermingle, to share everything and so forth, there is also a realization that the external factor has been very, very instrumental. That doesn't come out in the media so often. And when people had to build together again, and especially sometimes reporting to the practices from our tradition and culture, it was more appealing, and it proved that, you know, this unity was not just imaginary, it was real, and people are able to live it again. So I think that there's a dimension that really sets the foundation for the kind of hope we see in this survey, for people to see that it's possible to live together again and to lead a normal life where people are not discriminated against each other, where they share opportunities and so forth. And of course, there is the efforts that have been made both by the government and the church to promote the common good and to really try to help people to improve their lives. There has been a stratification of the population so that people who are needy can be helped. For example, for healthcare and so forth. And people even take individual initiatives to supply where it is needed, which really changes also the perspective. You see, like so in the old days, people were focused to see who is around, where, you know, I get the opportunities. But now everyone is focusing on improving his life and the future. Now, the theological aspect, and I'm glad that this is been identified, that reconciliation is more about actions than just theory. I mean, it's not just reconciliation, and the understanding of faith from our tradition is not just something I think about or I write about, something that is meant to be lived out. And when it is not lived out, then there is a suspicion, there is the contradiction that it creates incredibility. So even reconciliation is understood that way. But the only difficulty here is that there is no easy distinction between political reconciliation and religious reconciliation. There is a tendency to take everything to be just like religious reconciliation. For example, because the government and everyone was pushing for reconciliation, even people who needed more time to realize what happened to them, they felt compelled to do so. Why? Because political reconciliation tended to borrow from religion this easy closure, which is just done by God, and then the human agency seems to be secondary. And so that has created some uneasiness time to time, where you find people, especially survivors, saying, why should I forgive? Why? Just because they asked me to forgive, or say, I have forgiven because they asked me to. Yeah. So
very good.
The last one has to do with the support, faith as a support to reconciliation. I think this is very instrumental, and I can tell that from the survivors who actually survived from the churches where the perpetration of genocide were committed. As much as they felt desperate that God abandoned them because the killers were telling them so, but they also recognized that they were able to survive because of God, because they were praying to God for that to happen. And so there is a sense that God is not remote. God is with us. He's constantly a resource for life and for more life. And I think for most people, this is very strong, and I can tell from the different testimonies I have had. So maybe I can stop there.
On that last point that you mentioned, I'll pick up a question in the chat from Jay Carney, who asks about this question of faith in God. Why do you think the dominant religious response to the European Holocaust was loss of faith, as exemplified, for example, in Elisee, whereas that is not unfolded in Rwanda, as was shown, Dawid, in your data? Any thoughts about that?
Yeah, as I said, I feel like the Western perspective on faith is much more about a certain truth I believe in. Mm-hmm. Whereas for most African perspective, faith is part of life, and life is God-given in any case. And I'm sure David, who has been in Rwanda, he can tell you how many times people talk about God in their conversation. Even in one sentence, you can find everything is really around God. So God is not remote from life. And that's why when life is compromised, then that can lead to unbelief, because that is really attacking the heart of faith.
Thoughts on that, Dawid?
Which goes to my point when I was talking about the holiness of the church and the dignity of the human person. The church cannot be holy by simply professing the faith, following the doctrinal manner, whereas it is not really promoting human dignity. That would be a contradiction. Promoting human dignity and the right that goes along with it is actually a testimony to faith, because you recognizing this human person, the presence of the very creator who made him in his own image and likeness. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I would try to ask and well, maybe describe more my context. Well, there is a few questions about it. Why I consider this with the Holocaust context? Well, I live in Poland. As you know, the most of the concentration camps were in Poland, and as a Poland, we have to face with something like that. Even now, very often you can find in different paper titles, Polish concentration camps, and in Poland we know it's not true, yeah, because there was no Poland at the time of the Second War. Yeah, and but it comes sometimes by mistake, sometimes I don't know why. Yeah, I can only assume how it happens. But you know, before the Second War, we had the minority of the 10% of Jews in Poland, and we tried to live somehow. But also we had the common history of 1,000 years, because we had Jews in Poland from the beginning of our nationality, our country, and there was even special privileges like the Jewish cinematography in Poland with the each year festivals, Jewish schools and courts, and etc. etc. Yeah, one of the best friends of the young Karol Wojtyła was the Jewish boy Jurek Kluger. Yeah, so in every place, in every small town, we had Jews. Yeah, and now we almost not have them. Yeah. So this context of Jews who very often they lost their faith, yeah, because they were put into concentration camps and also they were burned to ashes in millions. Yeah, it's still living, but so that's why it's my narrow perspective as a Pole. Yeah, and also we have the discussion about the role of the faith in the public life. And also the role of the Catholic Church in Polish public life, and also decreasing numbers of the Catholics in Poland. Yeah, so that's why you see, yeah, it's my perspective. Yeah, so I can only extract it like that. Yeah, and I'm very grateful, yeah, for all of those questions and propositions. Yeah, because I see that I had some intuition, yeah, about asking those questions, yeah, but I really didn't know where it will lead me, where I will be in the end. So more I felt, to do this like that, to ask about some crucial questions, about crucial issues, but I felt that it may be important question, and I see so many answers right now, about the role of faith, the statistic European doesn't know anything about this, how African people live with their faith, how they are treating faith, Europeans mostly are not believers at this moment, and they are treating faith as one of the options of my life, just like they're wearing different color of trousers or something like that, and also we see how it's changed during the period of the one generation, how it's changing right now in Europe, and the African Christians, they're showing something different, something more important, the faith is a deeply rooted part of life, and also how it helps to survive during the entire process of the reconciliation. And also it is my interpretation. If any one of you is willing to contribute, to comment my my researches, I'm really open for this, because I know that I have something important, I have some data, I collected this, and I think that there was no investigation like that before, because I tried to find, the researchers like this, that somebody is asking Rwandans for their opinion on reconciliation, but not the Rwandan government. I really wanted to do something like that. Maybe there was done something like that before, but I couldn't find it. So I tried to prepare the investigation like that, and that's why it is what I achieved. So if you can help me, to prepare something bigger, and to put your perspective, and lighten it a little more, I'm really open for this.
Very good. Thank you, Dawid. And I invite you to put your contact information in the chat in case there's anybody who would like to comment you about greater access to your data, which I'm sure you would be happy to share. We need to move on with the program at this point. We're over time, but there are questions in the chat for both Father Dawid and Father Elisee. So if you are able on your own, I invite you to respond directly, if you would like, to the questions in the chat. But we have another couple of presenters to fit into the rest of our time for today. So I'm going to move right ahead and introduce Professor Leocadie Lushombo from Santa Clara University in California. She is a member of the Teresian Association and also has an appointment as a visiting professor at the Catholic University of the Congo. Like Father Elisee, she was trained in Boston College, where she got her degree in theological ethics. And she also did graduate work in Chicago and in Spain and Cameroon. So she's very well traveled. Her areas of expertise and interest include political theology, post-colonial liberation theologies, environmental ethics, which is, I think, a particularly important and under-acknowledged aspect of broader reconciliation projects. She has a recent book out, in addition to her chapter that she has contributed to Father Michel's, Marcel, and Elisee's book. She has a book, A Christian and African Ethic of Women's Political Participation, Living and Risen Beings. And we'll try to put a link to that up in the chat as well. She has done work on a number of very interesting topics, including Christological Foundations for Political Participation, Women in the Global South, Building Agency as Risen Beings. She has a paper on Fratelli Tutti, Toward a Community of Fraternity with the Wounded Women, and has written on the politics of forest conservation ethical dilemmas, and the impact on peace building. I happen to know that she is a member in good standing of the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, one of the brain trust of that organization here in the US. Her topic for today is Paths to Healing, Reconciliation, and Sustainable Peace. Leo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Bill. Let me share my screen. Okay, so what I have in mind, it's really grounding this issue of reconciliation in the biblical text of Luke Act, and why I do so. Because I believe Luke Act, and as biblical scholar, right, already say it, so I'm not biblical scholar, so what I did, it was really using biblical commentary and using many other biblical scholars like Christopher Rowe mainly. Luke Act offers us guideline for interpretation to remind us what a Christian community is supposed to be. And Luke Act, right, show that the Christian community needed to remind themselves about the root of the Christian faith and what it means to claim the Lord as a savior, you know, and the unique Lord, and what the implication of that claim really is for the Christian community, for the follower of Jesus, and how they strive, right, to live a community that, you know, try not to be divided according to class, status, as the first in that time, you know, many rich people were also joining the community, and you could have different classes within the Christian community, and they did thrive in preserving community, preserving the root, preserving Christian value, and not let social classes divide them. So more likely, they wanted to affirm the Christian faith so strongly, right? And I thought this is really a good ground, right, to build upon, right, to find the framework, you know, that can help Rwanda, you know, throughout this path to healing. And as the other speaker said, we can see how Rwanda is still very much religious, you know, despite everything that happened. So God is very important, and God is still, you know, this main root upon which people are trying to survive and to get reconciled. So the main purpose of the book of Acts is really testifying to Christian faith and encouraging believers to live in a certain way, teaching them about the proper doctrine of Christian faith, the implication, and also correcting problems in churches, just as the Church of Rwanda is trying to do right now. So how much we present conflict and clashes, these were the questions that were asked. Can we find good measure and method? Are we able to learn from the lesson of historical past? I really believe that there is an agenda, right, for healing and reconciliation and sustainable peace in the stories, right, that Luke Act is telling us. There are grounds that can shape a way of life that is coherent with Jesus' way of life. And this ground is mainly the primacy of faith. And I'm glad, you know, the previous speaker already, you know, showed that is there present so strongly in the reality of Rwanda, even after the genocide, no matter what, right? No matter how people kill each other in churches, right? So there is still, this sense of faith as something that we can only, grasp on. And the idea that we must obey God rather than men. So this is something that is really striking me a lot, because I have the view not only of Rwanda, but also of the Congo, where I am from. I have, the image of South Sudan, and all the conflict that are going on, in the region. So this obeying the authority, it's such a problem. And we must obey God rather than men. And the primacy of the Christian faith over any pagan culture. And what I have in mind as pagan, so it's not necessarily the fact that some people are not Christian or are not believer, but what I have in mind as pagan is every kind of culture that goes against the Christian one. Whatever obstructs a new Christian culture, right? New culture, that which is spring from the Christian faith, it's something that we really need to develop as path for reconciliation in Rwanda. And let me just share this idea for Emmanuel Katongole. The 1994 genocide in Rwanda must be placed in the narrative of the politics of competing elite interest and power struggles, rather than in those of ethnic or tribal interest. So just remind any process of reconciliation that is going on in Rwanda, just to remember this struggle for power, that as long as these dynamic are not, told, are not, looked at for deeply, right? Reconciliation process will still be in trouble, because this is a dynamic that is really a threat, not only in Rwanda, but in general in our country in Central Africa. The role of power, right? And the politic of power over the politic of service, the politic for the common good. Right? So the narrative program that are engaged, right, throughout look at and in these stories is this dynamic of return, epistrophe, just turn around, turn and having a different perspective than the one that we had before, right? And I think the book that is coming up already developed the historical background. Father Elisee did the same. How we get to the genocide. The post-colonial history and theories shows us how we get there to those kind of division, and how we ourselves perpetuate those divisions that we inherited, throughout colonization, and how deeply, we are in, right? And we start colonizing each other. Right? So there is a need for a turn of perspective in that sense, not only from the people individually, but from the politic, from the government, from the economic perspective, from the political perspective, from the cultural perspective. There is a need of this countercultural perspective view, moving from power to sharing, moving from centrality of authority, from listening to each other. So this is about converting to a way of life compatible with the Christian vision, a turning away from pagan cult, turning from a selfish sense of profit that often override the eagerness for love. And these are the dynamic that we see, right, in many of our countries, right? And that leads to so much division, to so much tensions. So the primacy of faith and civil orders, right, that hinder the will of God or conscience. So we need the primacy of faith, that we become strong enough, right, to resist, right, this kind of dynamic. And this is a new culture that is needed in order to become witnesses, right? Those are all the comments that we just heard now from the previous presenter, right, are showing the failure, to be a church that really is witnessing of this primacy of faith, right? So how do we become that kind of church from now on? So you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, in all Judea and Samaria, and to the end of the earth. Let us ponder these words. Let us live Christianity in a different way. So it's not enough to continue going back to the church, right? That we can affirm that movement, that the people are still very religious and they are present. But what kind of presence it is, right? Because that is what we were before, but we killed each other in churches anyway, right? So that's why I'm calling on this new culture, a real conversion, a real turn. Right? It will take a lot, right? It will take a lot to embrace a culture of radical response to God. It will take much to resist evil. We need a community where justice is practiced, and we need to learn how to do that. Dissociate with political maneuvering that prepares a new terrain for future genocide, because that is what is happening, right? So you can see the relationship that we have now between Rwanda and the Congo, as I will keep in mind this broader view in the region, right? So those political maneuvering, creating division, creating hate, right? You hear in discourses from the people, how people start saying, Rwanda this, Congo this, and that is the way it starts. So we need a new culture that is stronger enough for the Christian to remember and to realize that the primacy of faith is to be taken seriously, right? So it's not enough just to go to church. And so we need this new culture to perform signs that are healing and fortifying, lifting the poor, opting for equality, because this is a big issue. No matter what, our reconciliation tends to be most of the time very theoretical, but so we need to put the reconciliation in practice in such a way that even the sharing of resources, right, are involved. And we can see the difference. In that sense, the people can feel recognized in their dignity through those means. And look at as well suggests the three core of ecclesial practices. Confessing Jesus as Lord of all, becoming a community that is of mission of light, and the formation of Christian communities as the tangible presence of a people set apart, right, in daily life. So what confessing Jesus as the Lord of all entails, right? This anti-exposing an alternative way of life that is really kinship suggests. Resisting leaders who bear the sword against those who do right. And this is an example, right, that we have in many of our countries. When we have witnesses, when we have people who are capable of speaking out, and doing the right thing, those people often do not survive. Right? because the leader, do not want to hear that. So we need to train a community that can resist to this. We need to form a community that embrace a revolutionary consciousness. And this is from Katongole, The Sacrifice of Africa. A revolutionary consciousness is that which questions the politic of oppression and terror. So let us call those politics by name, because they are still directing, guiding our countries. Developing this consciousness should be the path to reconciliation and sustainable peace. And of course, this will be also a work of the Holy Spirit. Right? This is not only a matter of urgency. So we do need to go back to church and pray, to get there. What a mission of light will untie, right? Becoming inclusive, going beyond all the isms, but going beyond them even in mind, right? Not only in papers. Right? And I'm so glad that Rwanda did take out all who is Tutsi, who is Hutu, and that a step. But the Hutu Tutsi should not stay in the mind of the people, because that is where the big challenge is. Right? So it's taken on papers, but later let it also move on from the mind of the people. As we can see how it's happened, in such a way that tribalism is still present, right? Sexism is still present, no matter what. So we need this mission of light by churches, right? That we are going back to the church. So we need to start this process. We need to start a process as churches of a culture of exploitation, that resisting this culture of exploitation of the powerless by the powerful. We need to do this, but not only a culture of neutrality, right? And we need to become ecclesia, right? Which means becoming a new family, true new family, and a new identity that is shown in the fact that now there is no identity, official identity Tutsi Hutu. That's a kind of new identity, but let it move on from papers to the mindset. Right? Formation of Christian communities, politic of inclusion, bottom-up process, continual practice of forgiveness, recognition of Hutu who served the Tutsi and gave their life to protect them. Right? So this has to be present in the process of reconciliation. Recognizing Hutu women victims of rape, who also were targeted, the Tutsi women were, and that is most of the Tutsi, the story tell. How about the Hutu women as well, who were raped, targeted by the affiliation of marriage with Tutsi? So reconciliation needs to take all these aspects into consideration. And so what I'm suggesting, it's a resocialization that in many ways is already spoken of by the previous presenter. But this one developed the potential for cultural disruption. And it's a cultural disruption of the economy, of the tribalism, of power, of a hierarchy, of patriarchy. So we need a countercultural mode of life. And the biblical scholar that I mainly use with Christopher Ward, he says, new culture, yes, at coup, no. Those coup that we do to each other, right, in real life, and that are continuous, and that create serious violence in our countries. Yeah. So we need the disrupting of the status quo. Another kind of resocialization, it's a seeking social unity, right, between Christian theology and social life, empowering Christians to see the need for connecting eschatological ideas and social realities, promoting a new community of witnesses, and again, just distribution of resources. This is a serious problem that is continuing creating violence. Moving beyond a monarchical and a hierarchical society in which authority must be obeyed absolutely, even when it is wrong. And the researchers have demonstrated how obeying a chief without discussion or objection is part of the Rwanda soul. Right? And not only Rwanda, is part of our country's soul. Obeying authority, obeying the chief. This blind disobedience, blind obedience to authority, it's really a double-edged sword that need to be considered. And of course, promoting God's non-violence and reconciling love, considering God's grace, considering that the abuses that are beyond repair, right? As Bill O'Neill says in his new book, right? And keep considering those from both sides, no matter how much suffering has been to one side. Keep bringing the other side into the picture. Remembering the suffering of everyone. I know the suffering is not about quantity, right? But remembering all suffering and using the borders, right? Going beyond the borders, looking at the Rwandan borders, because since I'm from Congo, right, I know what is happening on the borders and how much violence, right, we are still having there around. And as long as these issues are not really recognized, that the leader of Rwanda, of Congo, and of Central Africa, all those neighboring countries do not get together and work on these issues, we are still in trouble. So let us do this, calling all evildoers to accountability, considering the extended range of the victim around the borders. Consider communities determined to heal their wound and in need of resocialization around the borders for Rwanda. And Katongole suggested that in his new book, Who Are My People? So he's talking about exploring the new form of identity. And I suggest that this exploration should not be limited to Rwanda inside, but go beyond the borders. So we need this new form of identities in order to really sustain this reconciliation and refrain from internal, external, political, economic power system that sustains so much injustice, and this around the borders. Again, resocialization, it's also about remembering and lamenting, as the previous speakers said, churches that became killing field during the genocide. But also, at the same time, it's remembering those who too refused to separate from the Tutsi in those churches. Things like those happen within those churches. And Emmanuel Katongole is telling the story in his new book of Father Jean Baptiste, the survivor of St. Joseph's School at Nyange, and who tell these stories, how people survive and they refuse to separate from each other. And they kept praying, and we have many of those stories. So we need to bring these stories in our picture of reconciliation. They are very important. Right? And how the healed who are ministering now, to the healing of the other people, or the survivor, like, Marcel and Elisee and all the others, how they are ministering now to healing other people, the power of prayers, to form a new community and to form new culture. So as my experience of Congo, I really ministered to refugees and was exposed to the killing, they suffer at the border of Rwanda and Eastern Democratic of Congo. That's why I'm very sensitive about reconciliation, taking that picture, right, into account. So I call for a lasting reconciliation that consider all evil related to the genocide against the Tutsi, as it's affected both Rwanda and neighboring countries, especially the DRC Congo. A sustainable effort toward reconciliation and peace will need to include all parties affected by evil act, performed in the Eastern DRC as well, where many millions of people, thousands of people were killed. There is no way one single country will move on if all the other countries are not together. So we need that kind of reconciliation. We need it. So even if this evil act, were considered legitimate as a last resort to prevent the perpetrator of the genocide from going unpunished, they must be examined as well and addressed by all relevant actors in the Great Lake region. When considering the onerous character of the genocide, we can affirm that the range of victims extended from the Tutsi within Rwanda territories to non-perpetrator refugees from Rwanda, as well as in the DRC. Millions of women and children were killed. So let reconciliation consider those pictures. And this doesn't mean to downplay the suffering of the Tutsi, not at all. But as next step is we are looking for the path we really need to bring in all this picture. So there is a great need for the Great Lake region to undertake a mutual reconciliation process and assume responsibility for a more just, peaceful region. And relevant actors and leaders must consider educating the mind, body, spirit to instill greater virtue in the people. And this is not only Rwanda, but the neighboring countries. Because what happened to Rwanda then happened to the Congo, and what happened in the Congo then happened to Rwanda. And all these hate issues that are going on from bad kind of governance that the Congo has, it's affected the people's mind, and it's end up affecting the neighboring country. So they must be accountable to the rule of law and justice, and refrain from internal and external political, economic systems that are cultivating unjust social structure and unjust distribution of goods. So do I still have some time, Bill?
Just a minute or two, if you can come to an end.
So the inclusion of the bottom-up process of reconciliation and peace. So while recognizing the effort and hopeful initiative, such as the 2018 Extraordinary Year of Reconciliation declared by the Rwandan Catholic Bishop, the apologies that Father Elisee talked about, and how Pope Francis is doing all this effort, to recognize the church role in the genocide against the Tutsi, a community of reconciled Tutsi and Hutu is needed and required now more than ever. And I keep calling at that community to go beyond the border, because there is many problem of the Hutu who fled the genocide and who are still at the other side. So we may embrace practices such as that of the women, Domitila, Tutsi women never, or many Hutu women who declare, right, as they say in French, j'ai pris l'initiative de leur adresser la parole et désormais nous travaillons ensemble. So these practices of reconciliation are really required within the borders so that we can get to this peaceful reconciliation. See, apologies are needed to set up clear theopolitical agendas in themselves a sign of hope, sign that no matter the intensity of darkness, God's light is breaking in. Right? As Archbishop Desmond Tutu said, the Bible describes God as creating the universe to be a cosmos and not a chaos, in which harmony, unity, order, fellowship, communion, peace, and justice will prevail, and that this divine intention was disturbed by sin, right? And this divine intention is being disturbed by the kind of politic of greed and plunder that we have within the border, and that need to be addressed as a path of reconciliation in Rwanda. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leo, for that biblically grounded, expanded version of reconciliation. As we did yesterday, I think we're going to end up going over time today, but we'll move right away to our next speaker. I'm very pleased to welcome Father Bill O'Neill, whom I've known for a number of decades now. He's one of the great American ethical thinkers on hermeneutics, on human rights, on Catholic social teaching. He was a protege of the wonderful Belgian philosopher of religion who was a friend of the Council for Research in Values and Philosophy for many years, Louis Dupré, and did his graduate work at Yale University. He mentioned to me that for some time now, he is, after having retired from Santa Clara University and the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley, he has been working in the camps in Kenya, refugee camps for the Jesuit Refugee Service. He mentioned that even in the midst of his work with child refugees there, he somehow managed to process and finalize and turn out 2 recent manuscripts, one of which Leo just cited, Reimagining Human Rights, Religion and the Common Good. His other book, most recent book, is Catholic Social Teaching, a User's Guide. He also just mentioned before the session started today that he recently had the opportunity to bring the words of some of the refugees that he works with through a homily to one of the attendees at a service here in Washington, D.C., namely President Biden. So without further ado, I'm going to turn things over to Bill O'Neill. Welcome. Oh, and his topic, Remembering Genocide, the Ethics of Anamnestic Solidarity.
Thank you, Bill. Great. Well, thank you all. Let me begin just by offering a word of gratitude to you, Bill, to Marcel, to Yiping for the invitation. It really is a privilege to join you. I don't know if I don't have a PowerPoint, Bill, so
That's
if you
quite
could
all
just
right.
see me. Yeah,
Yeah.
It's so difficult from the camp to make these arrangements. I'm speaking from the Kakuma refugee camp. A personal note as we begin, I was invited by a colleague of many would know, Augustine Karekezi, in 1995 while I was teaching in Kenya, to come to Rwanda, to travel throughout the country. And at first I hesitated because I felt, what could I offer? But I recognized he was inviting me to come and see, to bear witness. And for me, it was profoundly life-changing to see in church after church the bodies of our fellow Christians. I began teaching a course in reconciliation from that point on, seeking to learn and understand, but especially to think of theology as bearing witness, what it means for theology itself to be testimony. So I begin with a quote from Bertolt Brecht: "When sufferings become unendurable, the cries are no longer heard. The cries too fall like rain in summer." Theirs is a familiar litany, the cries that fall like rain in summer. Victims of genocide, we know, speak of unbearable suffering, sufferings, as Chekhov once said, that it seems only human beings can endure. Shoah, genocide, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, a half century of solemn declarations has not spared us saying never again, yet again. And yet tragedy is never simply given. Whether we remember victims' suffering as morally tragic or merely an unimportant failure of global politics depends upon our evoking what is effaced, our bringing to word what Levinas calls the transgressed command. And so the hermeneutical question looms large. Remembering genocide is never simply factual representation. Indeed, memory evokes not the pastness of the past, but its ethically fraught presence. To describe the concentration camp Sine era without outrage, says Hannah Arendt, is not to be objective, but to condone them. But whence our era? Whence our outrage? What crafts our memory? And this morning I'll briefly touch upon two differing, even incommensurable perspectives that figure tacitly often in our interpretations, how we remember. The thick, narratively bound imaginary of communitarian ethics and the thin meta-narrative of philosophic liberalism, neither, I wish to argue, suffices to evoke the morally tragic character of genocide. And so I would argue that we must look to a third mediating ethic that is neither thick nor thin, one that is indebted to traditional African wisdom and modern Roman Catholic social teaching, grounded in what the Holocaust philosopher Walter Benjamin calls an amnestic solidarity, the solidarity of remembrance. Now, the term genocide itself is of modern coinage. It invokes, as we heard yesterday, national, racial, or religious groups' natural right to exist. And yet that underlying rhetoric of natural or human rights is hardly self-evident. Indeed, just as the banner of rights was being raised, the modern doctrine was itself raised into doubt. For communitarians, ethics begins at home. We are knit together by shared history and sentiments. We have, in the English philosopher Edmund Burke's words, given to our frame of polity the image of a relation in blood. Rights then become not universal, but the patrimony of positive law, an entailed inheritance resting on the politics of the particular common good, the latent wisdom or prejudices of our distinctive traditions. Recognizing the bonds of membership in our community or subgroup is thus decisive, not only for justifying our politics, but for determining the very polity to which we are accountable. Ethical substance is fragmented, but for determining, and the thicker the good that binds us in solidarity, the less common it is in scope. Here in extremis, ethical criticism, even of genocide, becomes hermetic, local and ethnocentric. For finally, says the philosopher Richard Rorty, there is nothing deep inside us. No common human nature, no built-in solidarity, metaphysically bereft. We are left, he says, to tell sad and sentimental stories. And yet other stories may be told, concludes Rorty, where Hitler may be seen as in the right and the Jews in the wrong. And such stories are told. In the words of Emmanuel Katongole that Leo cited already, I quote, Rwanda's social history reveals to us how stories can kill. Yes, people did the killing in Rwanda. Yes, they needed weapons to do it. But apart from the story that taught Rwandans to understand themselves as Hutu and Tutsi, eternally at odds with one another, the genocide could not have happened. Our distaste or outrage for such stories, though genuine, then is of limited provenance from a communitarian perspective. Cruelty remains in the eyes of the beholder. The cries we hear are merely our own, and genocide, how we remember, becomes a token of the stories we tell, the prejudices of our particular communities. Now, over against this, we said we must certainly say more. Well, communitarian ethics may look to the local and ethnocentric politics of the common good. The liberal philosophic heritage, dominant much of our modern rhetoric, appeals to natural or human rights, rights that is, that are ascribed to sovereign selves, individuals emancipated, says Hannah Arendt, from all the tutelage of traditional morals and unencumbered by history. For liberalism as a philosophic doctrine, it's the very irreconcilability of our local or ethnocentric conceptions of the good that leads us to privilege the liberties of the moderns as our foremost human rights. So we think of rights as negative liberties, immunities from interference. And under the banner of negative freedom, the old idea of the common good is now only constructed through individual will. That is, positive obligations we have extend primarily to fellow citizens privy to the social contract. So the bonds of civic friendship are attenuated. To citizens, I owe limited contractual duties. To aliens, only the duty of forbearance. And here, it's what Arendt says, the perplexities of modern human rights emerge. She says those who were forcibly stateless refugees, the wake of the Second World War, the very notion of human rights broke down at the very moment when those who professed to believe it were, for the first time, she says, confronted with people who had indeed lost all other qualities except that they were human. The world, she said, found nothing sacred in the abstract nakedness of being human. Suffering did not disturb our undogmatic slumbers. And not surprisingly, these perplexities of human rights we see in one of the modern theorists, so renowned, John Rawls, who says that we derive our ethics from mutually disinterested contractual decision-making, that we take no interest in one another's interests. And we wonder, what then would we say of genocide in his original position? Is a right not to be its victim ascribed simply to the outcome of rational choice under the veil of ignorance? Now, Rawls offers a rather different account in his later writing, but what I want to understand here is that this notion of rights is so thin that it abstracts from our natural social relationships. We ascribe rights to a generalized other, and we fail to recognize the positive obligations, the narrative identities that separate victim and executioner. Ascribing rights to a generalized other obscures the particular victim's face, while attenuating our natural obligation to the common good, what Lyotard once calls the human community present in all of us. It limits our responsibility for their fate. So, in a nutshell, if communitarian ethics of genocide is blind, limited to the traditions of particular communities, the liberal narrative risks being empty, abstracted from tradition, bound by negative liberty. Sovereign individuals have little or no responsibility for the vulnerable other. As in Rwanda, the positive duty to intervene remains simply notional, while the antecedent positive duty to protect the vulnerable against systemic threats, the foreseeable precursors of genocide, see best and exercise in rhetorical license. An alternative, then, what I call ananestic solidarity, we come full circle, because if communitarian recognition of bonds to concrete others relativizes the tragedy of genocide, so liberal respect for the generalized others fails to generate positive moral obligations to its victims. We must, said Jacobo Timmerman, a victim of torture, he says, we must be loyal to our tragedy, and such remembrance bids us, I believe, to adopt a perspective that is neither thick nor thin, one of an amnestic solidarity, the solidarity that binds us in remembrance. We must remember genocide, for memory speaks in the command of the face. An amnestic solidarity extended, as Leo said, to all history's victims. It configures our story, our narrative identity. Benjamin, though, offers only an approximation, and it's a picture that must be filled in, and I believe can be filled in most notably by the wisdom of African traditional ethics, as well as modern Roman Catholic teaching. Now, so much can be said, but I worked for years in Tanzania during Julius Nyereri's Ujamaa program. He was deeply influenced by that, because for him, the rich communitarian conception of human rights, he calls it haki za binadamu in Kiswahili, is grounded not in the powers of sovereign selves, but in the complex social bonds of solidarity. Nyerere politics of ujamaa in a communitarian vein, he says, extends this polity to the image of relation in blood, the jamaa of the extended family, but ujamaa extends these bonds in concrete universality, not only to citizens, but to the Pan-African decolonial struggle, and finally to the solidarities comprising our common nature as bin Adam. We possess rights not in abstraction from the ensemble of social relationships, but precisely in virtue of them. Now, similar themes we know are sounded by Desmond Tutu, Nelson Mandela, in terms of the social harmony, the sense of Ubuntu, recognizing all of the caveats mentioned. But what is significant, and this is what I want to propose, is that rights are not a meta-narrative or a narrative. Rights talk is not talk about rights, but the kind of talk that rights makes possible. That is testimony. Rights become the grammar of testimony of anamnestic solidarity with victims. And similar wisdom, I believe, is present with the Rwandan tradition linking remembrance, kwibuka, and solidarity, ubuntu, but I leave this to theologians much more knowledgeable than I. Quick word of Roman Catholic social teaching, Bill knows so well, but we tell a similar tale. Rights inscribed within a common good and inspired by the great biblical imperatives of agape, justice and righteousness, tzedakah, mitzvah. In the reign of God, social teaching plays a maieutic role in modern pluralist societies. It allows us to translate these biblical themes into a political rhetoric today. And the translation is partial, fluid, to be sure. And a caveat, as we have seen in Elisee's remarkable work, the church must walk humbly here, in J. Carney's work, so deeply implicated in the genocide against Tutsis, a betrayal all the more given the developed body of its social teaching. There's no prophecy without repentance, and the burden of memory is born in the church's teaching and prophetic humility, I believe. The teaching requires the purification of memory, Francis tells us. In modern Roman Catholic social teaching, we know so well, we are bound by a Trinitarian God in indissoluble moral solidarity, as Leo has pointed out so powerfully for us in the preceding remarks. Here, dignity is in local garb. Catholic teaching specifies generalized respect for the concrete other. In the modern language of human rights, justice we speak of as equal recognition due moral persons and agents, and we know our rhetoric of rights includes not only we are free from, but what we are free for, the dignity of persons in solidarity, a deepening solidarity that constitutes the political common good. We have duties not merely of forbearance, not to interfere with others' life plans, but positive duties to preserve and protect the common good. And this translates, I think, the biblical language of hospitality into the option for the poor. Because the critical question, you see, if we believe in equal dignity and equal human rights, I see this in the camp each day, is whose equal dignity, whose equal rights are unequally threatened or denied. The very language of equal dignity demands an option for the poor. Who is missing from the table of policy? Whose story has suppressed or remains untold? Now, the implications of this for memory, I think, are profound. It shows how Catholic social teaching, as much African traditional wisdom, configures our story in solidarity with history's victim. Dignity binds us in solidarity, if only under the sign of its negation. Leavened by the thin rhetoric of rights, the thick solidarity of memory generates a primordial responsibility for victims. Now, no teaching ever redeems the unthinkable. When an act of violence or an offense has been committed, says Primo Levi, a Holocaust survivor, it is forever irreparable. But in heeding what Benjamin calls the suffering and the passion of our world, in hearing victims' testimony, the breach, the rupture, no longer appears as mere wretchedness. It acquires the quality of tragedy. As once general, when as in genocide, the victims are legion, but always ineluctably particular, haltingly in the telling of victim stories, in narrating the gross violations of human rights, we speak the transgressed command. History as remembrance, as anamnestic solidarity. And such solidarity permits us to do three things, a threefold hermeneutic, and I speak very briefly here. The first is that invoking anamnestic solidarity, we look not to the traditions of particular communities or the frustration of rational self-interest, but to the systemic transgression of the human community present in each other. Memory speaks as transgressed command, and the logic of remembrance, anamnesis, is self-implicating. We cannot get the memory right without recognizing dignity and the grammar of rights. For it is our history that bears the mark of Cain, and so we must say, never again, again. But it is not enough merely to recognize or repent. The cri de coeur is never merely notional, rhetorical license. To remember genocide and ananestic solidarity is to redeem the cry in systemic redress of the complex causal nexus culminating in genocide. Generalized respect for the concrete other thus turns on instantiating a rights regime, as Leo has reminded us, protecting all citizens, and hence a fortiori those who are systemically vulnerable. Critically, rights deconstruct supremacist mythologies, while constructively testimony is woven into a greater story that unites. And finally, these critical and constructive uses of rights combined in a hermeneutics of interpersonal redress, this third reconstructive role of rights. For the denial of rights leaves traces, you see, victims' claims to repentance, reparation. While liberal respect for a generalized other abstracts from history, ananestic solidarity implicates us, disclosing the distinctive roles we play, whether victim, perpetrator, or bystander. Our rhetoric must be thick enough to recognize concretely victim and perpetrator, yet thin enough to avoid fixing identity by narratively reifying or essentializing their roles. Ananestic solidarity resists closure. Respect is generalized across concrete roles, but just so guards against perpetuating the myth of eternal atavistic amnesty. Indeed, we betray the memory of genocide in failing to extend such solidarity to all history's victims. And a concluding theological perspective. So in these brief remarks, I've tried to show it's not enough to remember the past. Memory itself is no stay against atrocities. Stories become testimony in ananestic solidarity, invoking the grammar of rights, binding us to victims. Only then can testimony be woven into a greater story that indeed does unite. And such ananestic solidarity, not only to recognize genocide as morally tragic, the transgression against the community present in each, but to redeem the pledge never again in systemic redress, and finally, a generalized respect for the concrete other lets us name victim and perpetrator while reifying neither. But I want to suggest to you, not only are these moments of reconciliation, recognition, systemic and interpersonal redress, but there are different registers. The legal political register of what can be accomplished, for instance, in truth commissions or tribunals. There is the moral dimension that underwrites that, and there is a religious dimension. These are distinct but not separate. Recognizing mass atrocity generates systemic imperatives of redress for the victim and the perpetrator alike. But I want to suggest that forgiveness plays an important role. It is not so much a moral demand, I believe. A victim has a right to forgive, which implies, I believe, the right not to forgive from a moral perspective. There can be no cheap forgetting, and forgiveness may be a life's work for some victims. Yet the Christian duty to forgive, I want to propose, is supervenient or presupposes the victim's moral right to forgive. Securing that right, the victim's voice, is a necessary condition for being able to forgive. Forgiveness as the quintessential expression of Christian neighbor love transcends, I believe, even as it presupposes the exacting rhetoric of rights. Forgiveness cannot reinscribe victimhood. The Tutsi mother who forgives her child's executioner acts in utter gratuity. The thou uttered is particular, the divine command. Only she can forgive, and her forgiveness is unexacted. The executioner has no moral, much less legal claim to forgiveness. And yet what is morally permissible may be mandated, as Leo has reminded us, by our distinctive religious traditions. God, said Augustine, does not demand the impossible, but little by little makes possible. And this is the role of the Holy Spirit in us that can bring about the social healing and personal reconciliation. The solidarity of remembrance that grounds our legal and ethical discourse speaks too in a religious register. There is no religious suspension of the ethical. Christianly, the duty to forgive supervenes on the victim's right to forgive. Grace perfects nature. Still, what is morally supererogatory may be politically efficacious. In the wake of genocide, and perhaps even here, there is no future without forgiveness. Mercy, too, may fall like rain in summer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill, for that profound reflection on the solidarity of remembrance. And thank you too for that very tight presentation. We'll take 15 or 20 minutes, as we did yesterday, for discussion. I'm going to start by asking Leo if you have any reflections. I know you're familiar with Bill's work on rights. Is there anything you would like to add in connection to your own presentation today?
Yeah, so thank you, Bill. And I must say, I so enjoy reading your book.
Thank you.
Beside the philosophical component of it, it's really unbelievable, right? Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Leo.
Yeah, so this amnestic solidarity is history of remembrance. And the component of, the African value that you bring in, right? I wonder how challenging it is to make this African value, community of solidarity, become tools, so actually political tool, so that we can get to this systemic, right, and interpersonal redress, because it seems like the redressment tend to stay at the interpersonal level, because it's so difficult to get to the systemic. Right? So now how can this amnestic solidarity become possible, right? Considering, the African value and, in this view, I wonder.
Well, it's a wonderful question, Leo. And I have learned so much. The first teaching I ever did in human rights was drawing on Nyereri's work. Deeply influenced me. But this is your wisdom. This is the wisdom, I think, of younger African theologians like yourself. So many here, Elisee, Marcel, yourself, Leo. And it's not simply a matter of translating in a simplistic way. I recognize we have no English translation of Ubuntu or of Ujamaa. It's a deeply, as what you said, it's a cultural understanding of solidarity. And part of the task, I think, is mediating that. My concern as outsider, in a sense, is reversing the hermeneutical flow, because so often people think, well, rights were invented in the West. And my sense is there's a profound creativity that is occurring in the way you speak, Leo, the way others do, that we need to reclaim. In the church's use of rights has never abandoned the common good. And I think it's the brilliance of some of our younger theologians, African theologians, to give us a language and a vocabulary, and not merely, say, transcribing that into the prevailing discourse. As I say, sometimes we think of theologizing outside the box, but it's the same old box. I think you're giving us a new box, and this has to be your work. I can pay homage to it, but I truly feel this is part of the profound insight that the younger generation of theologians have. I'll give one little example. Bill mentioned ecological ethics. One of my former students, Chris Ongolele, wrote with Laurenti Magesa, but saying how an African perspective doesn't begin with the separation of the moral subject from nature, but with their complex relationships. And what a powerful way of reimagining an ecological ethics. So I simply encourage you to write. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bill, why stick with rights? As you mentioned, it's a term of art that is deeply associated with Western liberalism in particular, but other traditions as well. You referenced other ideals, African ideals, ideas like dignity. In the Catholic social tradition, rights is a relatively recent addition, but it's not a key terms. Why? What is it that rights offers? Why should we stick with that term when talking about genocide or about reconciliation or hope?
But I think part of the role, Bill, has to be deconstructive. That is to recognize that the language of rights itself goes back to the late 12th century. There are multiple rhetorics, multiple uses, but the one that has tended to dominate has been that of modern liberalism. Roman Catholic thought has incorporated the language of rights and does so, John the 23rd says, in our day we will realize the common good when a regime of rights is protecting, especially the most vulnerable. I think the value is that this is the language of political ethics today. It is the kind of regnant discourse. I think deconstructing it rather than abandoning it offers great promise. And that's why I'm thinking the hermeneutical function of rights, to deconstruct our supremacist narratives, to be able to allow a reconstruction of a social narrative privileging victim, the historicity of rights themselves. It's, in a certain sense, Bill, I think in Ignatius's sense, it's going in the door of modern politics to come out our own, to allow a deeper solidaristic sense of rights that I say allows us to speak of what the liberation say is an option for the poor in political terms, that if we truly believe in the language of rights and the dignity of persons, then there's no excuse for where I am here in Kakuma, children who are going hungry, who are lacking the rudiments of the very conditions of human dignity. So it's a complex question, but I think this is the dominant language of adjudication. I think rather than simply rejecting it or dismissing it, is to reconstruct it. There's a certain creativity, I think, in translation, and where something new is being created. The fact that here in the camp, refugees speak in the language of rights, but they do so not as sovereign selves seeking their own self-interest, but out of a sense of solidarity. Really a claim. I think the function of rights, as I've tried to say, as a grammar of solidarity, is to allow victims to speak. In other words, not to think of rights in a purely juridical sense, as claims or properties of sovereign selves, but as the sort of language that privileges a girl child, that allows her voice to be heard. I think of the children where I am at the Day of the African Child, singing a beautiful song that ended, I am an African child, give me a chance. That to me is the function of rights, is a way of allowing these voices to be heard, demanding systemic redress and interpersonal redress. At least, Bill, that's a very partial answer, but the best I can do.
Thank
Can
you very
I
much.
add one point about the right from the Chinese point of view?
Yes.
In Chinese, two characters, human
Yes.
right. Human right in
Yes.
two meanings. One is power, one is correct action. And if you want to understand human right, human power, and the human power has to act in correct way, then that's human rights.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And my sense is that if we actually pay attention to the rhetoric of rights, the way it's being used bottom up, we have this more solidaristic language being used. The Truth Commission, for instance, which I studied a bit in the book that Leo mentioned, is to see how this grammar of rights allowed privilege the testimony of victims, which testimony was woven over 2 years into a larger social narrative. But rights are often opposed to narrative. When I want to say rights make stories testimony, what makes a story testimony is the kind of grammar that claims us. And that's the hermeneutical function, I would argue, of rights, which I think, as you say, is power in under the sign of right. Yes, thank you.
Father Marcel, you had put a couple of questions in the chat. Would you like to elaborate on those a little bit?
Ms. Ho, your comment, I would develop your comment. We consider about this topic that growth of power means the increasing of responsibility. It was a topic we considered in our seminars. You remember this? Maybe it is the same that you say about this. Power means the right action, because right action derives from the responsibility for the others.
Yes.
So the power and the responsibility are similar, and they are joined with each other.
Yes, yes. Leo, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so I wanted to relate that to what you said about, the function of rights that becomes solidaristic in such a way that power also at the same time is deconstructed, and power also consider, as you said, not only the victim but also the perpetrator.
Yes. Yeah.
So power become an instrument of solidarity. I think that will be the path.
Yes. Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And what I mentioned earlier, perhaps just too fastly, we don't have a single translation, say Jama Ubuntu, but in social ethics, we speak of dignity and solidarity. And an excessive influence on the dignity of sovereign selves can lead to a kind of regnant individualism, a loss of responsibility. On the other hand, excessive emphasis on solidarity can lead to hermetic, local ethnocentric communities. The genius of Catholic teaching is aligning those. We do that with hyphens, dignity and solidarity. I think Ubuntu, Ujamaa, in a single word, capture that sense of deep, yes, humanity. What Leotard says is the human community present in each of us. But that sense that the language of rights is not intended to allow me to pursue my life plan unencumbered by others. It's realized in fostering solidarity and the common good. And the common good cannot be common where so many are excluded from it. And that's why rights are a morality of the depths. And I should have said, Bill's question, we disagree in the modern pluralistic culture that we have of so many differing ideas of human perfection. But what you've spoken of there, the reality and the claims of human suffering, that it's not mere wretchedness, but tragedy that claims us. Stories become testimony. If the language of rights does no more, then let us heed the cry of the victim. Then it has achieved something very important, a way of speaking of solidarity at its most fundamental level, when we say never again.
Marcel.
Yes, thank you very much to our two presenters, or should I say even the four presenters, really for very stimulating conversation, thought-provoking and well-researched. When you attend a conference like this, you actually read 20 books in a sitting. So it's wonderful. So thank you very much. I am sure maybe the others would agree with me. I put up two questions there. Maybe to begin with, Bir, you started saying that you visited Rwanda in 1995 and you met Father Karekezi, Augustine Karekezi, and
Yes.
we were coming out of this horrific experience, but Karekezi still had hope. And I remember towards the end of your chapter in our book, you quote him, he says, where you say, Rwandans have gone through this, but still we have the capacity to dream.
Yes.
And then you end with the quotation from Jeremiah 29:11. I know the plans I have for you, plans not to harm you, but to give you a future and a future with hope. And I think really what we have done here is to open up that hope. And if there is one thing that never dies, is hope. So in that perspective then of hope, as you really talk about this, we are at the heart of Christianity. This is the question I had put. If you agree with me, and this is to you, Leo and Bill, if you agree with me that at the heart of Christianity is the transformation of identity, really, of course, if I were to use Lonegan, the breaking down of biases at different levels. Then if we look at Rwanda and other places, David has shared with us also the experience of Poland. Where do we go wrong in the failure of this transformation of identity? And what mechanisms can we set to foster this transformation where the Christian DNA, I am using this in an allegorical sense, becomes thicker than ethnic DNA? And I borrow this because we have used the word thick and thin a lot. So
yes,
I wanted to bring that. That's the first question. And maybe the second question is to you directly, Bir. So the first is to both of you. The second is to you, Bir. in your discourse on our monastic solidarity, to what extent do memorial monuments or memorial sites, such as Auschwitz, or even Nyamata, which you visited,
Yes.
you remember in
Yes.
2019.
Yes, yes.
What
Yes.
role do these memorial sites play, or to be more broader, downplay, we are scholars here, in this solidarity with the victims of history?
Yes.
How can amnestic solidarity challenge deniers of history's tragedies like the genocide or those buried in Nyamata?
Yes.
Those are my two
Leo,
questions.
why don't you begin, Leo, and then I can respond. So
Okay. So where do we go wrong in the transformation of identity? I think I would, just going back to Bill's insight of amnestic solidarity, I would say, and the point that he's making about deconstructing, right? The hermeneutic of right, the narrative of right that we had all at this point, which are very much individualistic, very much my right, and the need of bringing in, the Ujamaa idea, just the remembering in much more systemic way what happened, right? So then let us transform, our perspective to this transformation of identity as well. So who is constructing it? How is it constructed, right? Is it solidaristic enough, right? Is that construction systemic enough? Is that construction really being faithful to history, being faithful to the suffering, being faithful to, to the complexity of the causes of that led to genocide, right? So I think that is what I would say. Let that transformation be the construct as well. That construction of a new identity be the constructed. It doesn't have to be done from the perspective only of the power, right? Only of one-sided, only of the victim, right? Maybe this is but maybe also from the perpetrator suffering, because as Bill said, those are suffering as well, right? I mean, and they are part of all the story, right? So they have to be part of this process of transformation of identity so that it can really be solidaristic in that sense, yeah.
You see, let me interfere here. Excuse me, let me interfere in your conversation. Identity is, to me, the very complicated phenomenon. It is not only simple coincidence. It is some kind of difference, which will keep the difference within the identity. This difference is driving of transformation of identity in the new form of coincidence. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I think that's quite right. That and as Leo says, the complexity of identity and the way identity can be shaped and formed through a kind of social constructivism. I think it's remarkable that genocides occurring within a few years in Bosnia, as in Rwanda, that in both cases there was a myth of atavistic enmity that had been nurtured really in the 19th century, denying that not to have halcyon relations in the past, but the idea that there has been eternal enmity between ethnic groups was itself a social construction, abetted, I think, by Belgium, later French realpolitik. We know the whole story. Identity cards have a fixed identity, the Hamitic myth that underwrote some Belgian politics. All of this is how identities can be socially constructed. When I would teach reconciliation, because I had students from all over the world, I would always include racism, white supremacy in the United States, lest we think this is an alien phenomenon. This is creating a mythology, the myth of replacement, that whites are the victims. That's why the language of rights has to give us a measure of objectivity, in the sense, not that we agree all the way down, but that we can name atrocity and we can recount our histories in such a way that we can find our footing. So what you say is true. It's not that our particular identities cease to exist, but that we can at least name those wounds that where suffering becomes more than mere wretchedness. And to answer, at least not to answer, but to respond to Marcel's question, memorials, I think, become the material culture of suffering. They show this is not mere wretchedness. You see at the Holocaust Memorial, rooms filled with shoes. This is not simply the presentation of artifacts. It evokes a people, a memory, something that can touch our hearts deeply. But I think, again, it's a question of is that memory capacious enough? The genocide is a crime against humanity, and not merely against a particular ethnic group, although it manifests itself in, for instance, the genocide against Tutsis, and that, to be sure. But I quote at one point Graham Greene, the novelist, and they were asking him one point, well, why aren't you more political in your writings? He says, I'm a writer. Writer writes about the victims, and the victims change. The victims can change. So we need a language that doesn't fix or essentially reify identities as supremacist narratives so readily do, and allowing that space for identities to be constructed, for stories to be told that demonstrate the nuance and the complexity of solidarity, and as you said, of difference. That difference is embraced within that. That's where I think that a narrative approach is absolutely critical. The divisions philosophically between rights talk and narrative talk, I think, to bring those together, but allow certain stories to be privileged, stories that become testimony. And I think testimony becomes, in the material culture, embodied at our memorials. But what's critical, I think, just as a footnote to that I think is well done at the Holocaust Museum, is to help us understand that the Holocaust is not just the social pathology of the worst of the Nazis. It's the silence of the good people, to see how this could happen, to understand, I think what you were saying, Leo, the precursors of genocide. Genocide is never simply visited upon us. There's always historic denial of fundamental human rights. You were mentioning, Marcel, you yourself were mentioning these in Elisee in your experience. This is why an understanding of memory can allow us to address not only the culmination of genocide, but all of the precursors, the systemic factors, the vectors that led to it. And a memorial can help us to see how good people could be seduced in a way. And finally, I believe what several of you have said, to memorialize the righteous, those who stood against the ethnicizing of genocide, who refused to allow their story to be appropriated by the genocidaires. And that, I think, is a powerful part. And you see that in certainly the Holocaust Memorial, the story of the just, of the righteous, commemorated. I think remembering the story of people like Felicity becomes extraordinarily important as tokens of reconciliation and tokens of hope, as Marcel had said. That's enough for me.
Thank you. We'll do just one more quick exchange. I did want to read Gustav Ineza's question to Leocadie, and also Elisee, you checked in, I think. We'll get a final word from you. Gustav writes, I think it is a noble endeavor and ministry to speak and plan for reconciliation between divided African identities, starting from our cultural and religious ethos. However, I fear that it is a mere performance because we're being asked to do it. Why do I say this? I belong to PACTPAN, one of the many networks of African theologians. I work on its approach to LGBTQIA+ issues. In some of our presentations, I see that even theologians and religious people can be vectors of hate and deadly words. Sister Leocadie, how authentic do you think this journey is from people who confess Jesus as Lord of all, when our people can easily revert to death rhetoric whenever issues of identity arise? So that was one question that was drawn in the chat. And Elisee, did you want to add a question or comment?
Yeah, I have a question for Bill. First of all, Bill, thank you so much for your presentation. It is always good to hear you, and it is very profound. My question has to do with the impact of do you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Okay.
yes.
We talked about the potential of the construction of narrative to impact power. But I really wonder how this becomes effective, given that power structures are not necessarily changed by narratives. There are so many other factors, and power tend to protect itself and tend to be invasive, and tends to have more means than simple victims who try to use narrative and rhetoric to change the narrative of the life. So how do you see the narrative really impacting power positive?
Thank you. Do you want to speak?
Yeah, go ahead,
first?
Leo, and then we'll.
And then I'll come back to that.
Okay.
Sure. It's a
All right.
great question.
Sorry, I was reading the question of Gustavo to be able to respond. So can you quickly repeat the question, please?
The question from Gustav?
No, from Elisee.
Oh, from Elisee. I think it was directed more to Bill, but yeah.
So now I have to respond to Gustavo's question.
If you'd like, if you.
Yeah. So that is what I was reading. So I will say this is a process, I think this is not something that can be easily done, and that's why we keep thinking about the Holy Spirit, the grace of God, and the force of prayer. So, that's why I like to bring up in my talk, how prayer can help people, actually to go beyond, what that capacity of selfishness and trying to strive just for yourself, from that individualistic perspective. But a prayer could help us also to remember our solidaristic nature, right? To remember that alone we are not getting, what we want to be, and that we will always be in need of this ujamaa, which is very African, but it's very theological. Anthropology as well. The ujamaa is the very nature of human being, So, but we need spaces in order to remember, continually. That's why I call on churches, right? Not only going to church, right? But using the tools necessary for this remembrance of who we are. I think we can get there if we embrace the process, but we have to embrace it. And it's a long journey. It's a long journey.
Thank you. Bill, last words?
Yes, sure. Well, I hope it's not the last, Bill, but because so much richness in the conference. But the question of Elisee, that stories can provide eloquence, rhetoric, but do they yield power? And I think here I would say it's the interplay of that threefold hermeneutic I mentioned, that the recognition of violation, of atrocity, the interpersonal dimension of privileging victims, of allowing that transgression to be brought to word, but the systemic dimension, how this can be institutionalized. And with all of its many limitations, I fully recognize, but I was privileged to attend some of the South African Truth Commissions. And over that 2 years of testimony, individual stories of victims were woven into what Charles Villa-Vicencio, the research director, described as a greater story that unites. It certainly contributed to the deconstruction of apartheid. At the beginning of the Truth Commission, apartheid was provided with a quasi-religious legitimation. The victims' testimony corroborated by that of perpetrators, their testimony in the amnesty context, again at the legal level, which is limited, but it did allow for the deconstruction of that legitimating narrative. At the end, Tutu said it is almost impossible now to legitimate this language of apartheid. So yes, the individual stories, when they are able to be woven into larger social narrative, but that implies something like a truth commission or testimony, which we are sorely lacking in the United States with respect to race. But there have to be ways in which stories become institutionalized, where they become our collective memory, and especially where it is countering a collective memory that is simply steeped in bias. The deconstruction is the first step, but it's done, I think, through testimony that collectively is able to allow a different story to be told. Yeah, so I just end with that.
All right, thank you, Bill. And a warm thank you again to Leo and Bill and Dawid and Elisee for all of your contributions to the conference today, as well as to the participants from yesterday. I want to thank again Hu Yeping for all the organization that went into this meeting, and Father Marcel, Uwineza, for all of your good work as well. This concludes the session for today, but I think you can already see that the discussion is ongoing. I encourage you all to remain in contact with each other and continue to share your work, and most of all, to continue working together on our central questions today of reconciliation, healing, and hope. The recording for this event will be made available to all of you. Thank you again.
Have a
Thank
good
you all.
weekend.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. God bless.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy
Thank you very
Sunday.
much. God bless you all.
See you next time.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.